Hi, I'm Alana Hippensteel from Pharmacy Times. Before we get started, one of our top articles today discusses a new study that shows that biological processes may be limiting the ability of insulin to adapt to obesity, rendering many people vulnerable to type 2 diabetes. There's more of that on pharmacytimes.com. Today, I'm speaking with Chad Landmon, the chair of intellectual property and FDA practice groups at Axon, Veltrop, and Harkrider, on the arguments presented to the Supreme Court on whether a legislative change to the Affordable Care Act makes the law unconstitutional, which would in turn eliminate Title VII, the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act. We will be discussing what the arguments are and what the potential ramifications are for pharmacy with these upcoming presentations in the Supreme Court. So, Chad, could you give a brief overview on the arguments being presented in the Supreme Court regarding the legislative change to the Affordable Care Act and what the implications are of a decision by the Supreme Court on the Affordable Care Act?
Sure, and thanks for having me. It's certainly an interesting topic. Obviously, it's in the news everywhere, and certainly something that's pretty interesting. So, just need to back up, give a little bit of history here. Everyone knows the Affordable Care Act, sometimes referred to as Obamacare, but the Affordable Care Act has gone through a number of challenges throughout the years. And I was going to focus starting back on kind of the original case that was up before the Supreme Court, and that was in 2012. And that was primarily a constitutional challenge to two aspects of the Affordable Care Act. One was an aspect that required states to expand their Medicaid coverage. And then another aspect is what people typically refer to as the individual mandate. And that was a requirement by Congress. It's in the Affordable Care Act that every individual goes and buys their own insurance. At the time in 2012, that had a tax penalty for the individual mandate. So there was this constitutional challenge brought back to the Affordable Care Act back then. It got up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court struck down the Medicaid provisions, said that Congress essentially didn't have the authority to order the states to do something because that was essentially the Medicaid expansion. But when the court turned to the individual mandate, the Supreme Court upheld that in a narrow 5-4 decision, but upheld it and said that it came under Congress's taxing power. And the reason they got there is the penalty for not going and buying your insurance for following the individual mandate was a tax imposed by the IRS. So that went through the Affordable Care Act at the time, then was mostly upheld except for that Medicaid provision. Well, you fast forward, and as everyone probably knows, Congress has, over the years, had a lot of different proposals to replace the Affordable Care Act, to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. And as many people probably are aware, that never passed, getting rid of the entirety of the Affordable Care Act. But in 2017, Congress did amend the Affordable Care Act to reduce that tax penalty to $0. So essentially, there is still the individual mandate. Everyone's still required to buy insurance, but there's no penalty for it. So after that was passed, there was then a second round of challenges. I mean, there's been multiple challenges, so I probably shouldn't call it a second round, but another round of challenges that was brought to the Affordable Care Act. This was a case down in Texas. The district court found the individual mandate now unconstitutional because there was no tax penalty, so it couldn't rely on the court's holding that this was under Congress's taxing power. That case got appealed up first to intermediate, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then to the Supreme Court. And those were the arguments that were just heard by the Supreme Court this past week. Essentially, what the challenge is arguing that Congress doesn't have the authority to compel individuals in the United States to buy health insurance. And the essence of the challenge is, well, it can't come under their Congress's taxing power because there is no tax penalty anymore. So it's not something assessed by the IRS. And then if you kind of run through, all the other constitutional provisions, what does Congress have the power to do? It can spend money, it can declare war, things like that. There was no, the challenge is that there's no umbrella to fit it under anymore. So that was the arguments that we heard to the Affordable Care Act. The big question that impacts what we're going to talk about with the BPCIA, but the big question even if the court does strike down the individual mandate, does the court have to throw out the entirety of the Affordable Care Act?
Right.
And essentially, not getting down into the weeds of this um, constitutional legal issue. The issue comes down to whether they call it severability, whether the court can sever or remove part of the statute and leave the rest in place. And the Affordable Care Act, I think they've been talking about it now. It's like 900 something pages of a statute now. And the question is, if the court comes and holds that the individual mandate is unconstitutional, that Congress didn't have the power, will the court upheld or at least leave in place the rest of the statute? And that's probably the crux of what we're going to hear from the Supreme Court when it does render a decision.
Right, right. So you mentioned the BPCIA, which is the Biologics Price Competition Innovation Act. How could you explain further what it is, and how would a ruling by the Supreme Court on the Affordable Care Act affect the BPCIA?
Sure. Yeah, so the BPCIA was really the legislation that allowed us to have biosimilars. So up until the passage of the BPCIA, many of the listeners probably are aware, we have what people refer to as drug products, which are typically the small molecule products. And then we've had for a very long time these biologic products. They're large molecule products, for lack of a better word. Up until the passage of the BPCIA, there was no way to get approval for a quote unquote generic version or a quote unquote similar version of a biologic. As you're probably aware, on the drug side, the generic drug industry, when it's gigantic, it provides hundreds of billions of dollars in cost savings to consumers and payers. And the way that works is through an act back in 1984. Basically, the Hatch-Waxman Act created the provisions by which FDA could approve generic drugs. There was no similar provision on the biologic side. So what the BPCIA does is it provides different mechanisms by which someone can go to FDA, can get approval for a biosimilar product. So a product that's is similar to the biologic. There's actually a provision that says you can get a designation as being interchangeable, which is a product which is nearly identical to the biologic. There hasn't been a lot of activity there yet. It's really been companies focusing on the biosimilars. But what we've seen, particularly over the last few years, it took a little while after the BPCIA was passed for companies to do the development work, also to interact with FDA to find out what was going to be required to submit a biosimilar application. But we have started to see FDA grant these licenses to biosimilar products. The general idea, will they drive down costs as much as generic drugs? The short answer to that is no. But will they create competition and drive down costs generally for biologic products? Yes, maybe not to the same degree as generic drugs. So essentially, the BPCIA provides that mechanism so these products can get to market. And oddly, at least to me, it was passed as part of the Affordable Care Act. It was the BPCIA had been talked about for nearly a decade in different forms. Congress had, through the years kind of amended what they were talking about. But eventually, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, the BPCIA was passed as part of that.
Right, right. So you've talked a bit about the impact of the BPCIA on the pharmaceutical industry. Do you foresee, or what would you say would be the importance of this act specifically on the pharmacy, and what would its potential elimination mean for a pharmacy?
Sure. So we're starting to see these biosimilar products come to market slowly. There's been a lot of patent litigation about them. There's been, a lot of agreements to get on the market at some point in the future due to the patents. But as time goes on, I think we will see more and more biosimilars come to market. That will drive down prices. It will create other options for pharmacies and pharmacists to dispense these biosimilar versions. It will certainly drive down costs then for kind of everybody in the distribution chain. And the importance of the BPCIA, if the Supreme Court decided that it was not severable, that it was basically thrown out with the Affordable Care Act, big question marks get raised as to, what do you do with the products who have already been approved? Certainly, it does, it takes away this whole way to market for biosimilar products going forward. I think what we heard during the arguments, particularly Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh, seem to be in favor of severability. So in other words, they might throw out the individual mandate, but they'd preserve the rest of it.
Yeah.
So it at least seems like that's where the court is heading. It is always so hard to read the tea leaves after listening to a Supreme Court argument. As they go back and they put things together, it's always hard to tell where they're going to come out. But at least that's the kind of general sense you get from listening to the questions from the court.
Right, right. So in terms of the argument for maintaining the BPCIA, what would you say that argument currently is, as you expect it to be presented or has already been presented in the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so, essentially what the argument's been, and I should back up, there has not been a lot of discussion of the BPCIA during the litigation.
Okay.
The courts, both the lower courts and the Supreme Court, have been focused more broadly on the entirety of the Affordable Care Act and the individual mandate. There have been briefs, like the Association for Accessible Medicine submitted a brief solely focused or virtually solely focused on the BPCIA and that it should be preserved. And the argument really goes to what was Congress's intent, and did Congress intend for the BPCIA to remain in place if the rest of the statute is found invalid? And there was some interesting discussion both in the briefs and then during oral argument before the court. When Congress amended the statute, the Affordable Care Act, to reduce the individual mandate penalty to 0, they left the rest of the statute in place. They didn't change anything else. I know Chief Justice Roberts commented on that, basically isn't that then congressional intent that they meant the rest of the statute to remain in place, even if there's no penalty any longer on the individual mandate? Okay. So the focus really is there, that it wasn't Congress's intent that the BPCA was part of this integral statute. And it certainly can survive on its own. I mean, if you remove the individual mandate, that really doesn't affect at all the way the BPCIA operates. So that's kind of where the argument's been and what the focus has been with the BPCIA. Mm-hmm. I should just kind of quickly note, it's also possible that the Supreme Court says, the individual mandate's unconstitutional, but we're going to send the case back down to the lower courts to decide this issue of severability. Okay. If that happens, frankly, we're probably another 2 or 3 years away from the case coming back up to the Supreme Court on what that looks like, and that would leave the BPCIA in place while that's playing out in the lower courts.
Okay. What would you say are the potential short-term and long-term implications of the elimination of the BPCIA if that was to occur?
Yeah, so certainly short term. A lot of confusion. There would be a lot of uncertainty out there. I think FDA would have to decide, and maybe even future courts would have to decide, what does that mean for biosimilars who have already obtained their license from FDA, have already been allowed on the market. Mm-hmm. On a longer term basis, or maybe also on a short term basis, companies who are in the biosimilar industry are going to have to decide where to invest their money, whether they continue to invest in these biosimilars or whether they, come to a full stop. I mean, FDA has hired, probably thousands of employees who are working on the biosimilars. Mm-hmm. And, what does that do to them, particularly in the short term? In the longer term, I know throughout Congress, this is a bipartisan effort. The BPCIA was a bipartisan effort. There is largely bipartisan agreement on the fundamentals of the BPCIA and biosimilars in particular. So, I think what we would see lobbying efforts toward Congress to at least repass, the BPCIA as it is, or something very similar to it separately. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I don't need to tell you, it takes a long time to get things through Congress, and getting agreement on almost anything these days is impossible. We with the presidential election, that may make it even harder, at least in the short term. Yeah. But You know, I think generally there's a lot of support for biosimilars. So I would think if the Supreme Court or the lower courts, if it got remanded, if they found the BPCIA was unconstitutional with the rest of the act, I think there's support to get something in place to replace it, hopefully relatively quickly.
Right, right. Do you have any final thoughts on the impact of an upcoming decision by the Supreme Court on this issue for specifically the pharmacy and the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, it's something that needs to be obviously watched. I think those who are involved with various lobbying efforts, getting this on the minds of people in Congress, both in the Senate and the House, as something that's may need to be addressed if the court goes that way. And obviously, business planning. I mean, I think it leaves businesses in a really tough spot in terms of how they plan. Depending on when the decision comes out, and we're probably about 6 months away from a decision coming out. So there's like a lot of time in there.
Yeah.
So figuring out how to plan your resources during that time, I think it is a lot of uncertainty. It's always difficult living in uncertainty and how you put your business plans together. But that's kind of to me the one thing, and just keeping your eye on it and being really involved to the extent you can with policymakers to address it if the Supreme Court does come out that way.
Right, right. Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Chad. Now let's hear from some of our other MJH Life Sciences brands on their latest headlines.